This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history.
Episode 16, Hero Among Heroes. Gilbert took a swallow of his drink, his fork pushing his food around on his plate as he heard the conversations echoing all around him throughout the grand room. Generally speaking, he felt terribly awkward and out of place at social events. He still remembered the way he'd stumbled through a dance with Marie Antoinette and how she'd laughed at him. Needless to say, he hadn't been anxious to dance since. His naturally reserved nature didn't provoke him to contribute to conversation often, but he felt more at ease having a number of his Masonic brothers among the dinner guests at this particular event. Joining the Masonic Military Lodge had provided him the brotherhood that he'd never experienced growing up as an only child, and he so much preferred their company and conversation to what he'd come to expect from the lavish balls and feasts held by the upper class. He just didn't feel comfortable in their company, nor inclined to join their inane discussions over the latest fashions in men's wigs. It was perhaps a strange sentiment for a marquis, and one of the wealthiest young men in France, but he was a country boy at heart, and often reflected on the days that he'd spent as a child, living in the countryside with his kind-hearted grandmother. It had been a drastic change when his mother had brought him to live with her and his grandfather in Paris, not long before both she and his grandfather had died, leaving this world to join his father in the hereafter. Gilbert didn't say much, but he smiled at the comment of one of the men at the table, his eyes trailing to another of his Masonic brothers, the host of the gathering. Broglie was a small man, but he held himself erect. He was listening quite intently to the man whom he'd given the dinner to honor, the Duke of Gloucester, the younger brother to King George III of Britain. They'd been discussing political affairs over in England when the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Yes, my brother has his hands full at the moment," the Duke explained, "with Britain's colonial settlements in the West Indies and India, but especially in America. Have you heard of what's happening?" Some nodded, but many around the table shook their heads. Gilbert fixed his eyes on the Duke, his interest piqued. The Duke smiled, continuing, "The colonies are in all-out rebellion. They've got this strange notion that they might somehow overpower Britain, and are refusing to be peacefully subjected." "They plan to go to war then?" a man asked from down the table. "Do they even have resources to pursue such a course?" the man further pressed. The Duke laughed. "That's the wonder of it. They're hardly more than a group of farmers, with little weaponry at all. But their determination is quite commendable. My brother is infuriated at their treason, but I must admit that I admire their fighting spirit. They've given the British troops a difficult time so far, and as impossible as their case may be, I suppose they are motivated by a grand, if rather radical, idea. They are a people fighting for liberty." Gilbert listened with complete fascination. Something had stirred inside of him at the words, something that had burned into his soul. Images of these humble people struggling for freedom had awakened every noble feeling in his heart. As the Duke continued to elaborate on the events over in America, the feeling grew to utter conviction. It engrossed Gilbert's mind so completely that he felt utterly captivated by it. Such a glorious cause had never rallied the attention of mankind. Right then and there, Gilbert gave his heart to their cause. He could think of nothing but hoisting his banner and adding his colors to theirs. One way or another, he was determined to join them. There was a time when the heroes whose names became legend truly lived and breathed. I'm not talking about the imaginary heroes, like Superman or Batman, that are crafted in people's imaginations and then portrayed on the big screen. I mean real heroes, who sweat and bled and sacrificed for a worthy cause. Men and women motivated by honor and virtue, who truly made an imprint on the world's history. I think it's sad that we're often more familiar with the imaginary heroes than the real ones, who stay contained in the pages of our history books, unheralded and forgotten. And something that I've noticed is that heroes seem to emerge during the darkest times. Bob Riley put it well when he said, "Hard times don't create heroes. It is during the hard times when the hero within us is revealed." That being said, I don't believe that God ever does anything by happenstance. When the devil raises up a villain, God raises up a hero. He places that person in the right time and place to help counteract those dark forces. In episode 14, we talked about Benedict Arnold. Well, just since doing that episode, I have come across Benedict Arnold's countering force. He was as loyal as Arnold was deceitful, and not coincidentally, was one of the men standing next to Washington as he learned of Arnold's treachery at West Point. He was truly raised up by God to be an instrument in his hands. And I'll be honest, up until a couple of weeks ago, I knew very little about him. And it's been a privilege to become more acquainted with the details of his life. His name was Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, but most Americans know him simply as Lafayette. He really was a hero of two different nations, and he lived to not only experience, but to be a key player during some of the world's most earth-shaking events. To do his story any kind of justice, I'm going to have to do it in two parts. One episode covering his role in the American Revolution, and the other, his role in the French Revolution. But as always, let's start at the beginning. Lafayette's noble warrior roots reached back over the centuries. His entire lineage was full of swordsmen, from those who rode with St. Louis in the Sixth Crusade to Gilbert III, who fought alongside Joan of Arc. From the time he came into the world, September 6, 1757, Lafayette's head was filled with these stories. He said, "It was natural that I grew up hearing many tales of war and glory, in a family so closely tied to memories and sorrows associated with war." From the time that he could walk and talk, his grandmother regaled stories of brave knights and honor. Lafayette's grandfather fell wounded 3 times fighting in the French army against Britain, and Lafayette was only 2 years old when his father died at the age of 25 in a hail of British cannon fire, leaving his young son as his only heir. The death of Lafayette's father left his mother completely distraught, and she soon left to Paris to seek comfort from her father and grandfather, leaving Lafayette in the care of his aunt and grandmother in the countryside of France. Lafayette spent a great deal of time romping about the grounds, slashing his wooden sword at imaginary foes. He was a very handsome boy, with fiery red curls, truly the combination of his parents' physical beauty, his grandmother's goodness, and the nobility of the knights whose blood still flowed in his veins. At this period in France, class distinctions were sharp and unyielding. The upper class were exempt from taxes, and the burden lay solely on the backs of the laboring class. It was so bad that many had to feed their families on gleanings after taxes had sapped their entire income. As a Paris magistrate put it, every class must share equal responsibility to preserve order in an efficient monarchy. The clergy provides instruction, religious services, and solace. The nobility counsels the sovereign and sheds its blood to defend the state. And the lowest class, which cannot render such distinguished services, fulfills its responsibility to the state with taxes, hard work, and labor. But when Lafayette's father died, the chateau where he grew up was left to the management of his grandmother, who was, quote, "a woman of the highest character, respected throughout the province and universally venerated for her kindness and generosity." As Harlow Giles Unger put it, hers was an islet of liberty in a sea of oppression. She extracted only the resources that were needed for her family, and she gave the rest to the villagers, even inviting them to hunt in her forests. This allowed the peasants to have enough money not only for their families, but enough to sell at market so that they could actually make a profit from their labors. Village heads would travel up to 60 miles just to consult her. And unlike the angry and oppressed peasants in other parts of France, the people would cheer and doff their hats when the young Lafayette and his aunt or grandmother rode past. Because of this, the young boy grew up with a deep love, affection, and respect for the people of the lower class. Now, there's a story from Lafayette's childhood that I feel, in a way, embodies his character and helps us to understand him. When he was 10 years old, a terrible beast invaded the region, killing livestock. Word quickly spread that the damage it had done was enormous. Some rumors even reported that it was a hyena that had slaughtered 122 women and children. The young Lafayette, upon hearing these tales, marched inside, grabbed his father's musket from its wall mounts, and charged into the forest, his heart, quote, beating with excitement to slay this hyena. With his tutor and aunt losing their minds with fright, little Lafayette insisted to his grandmother afterwards, "I am the lord of this village. It is up to me to defend it." In the end, he didn't find what turned out to be just a larger-than-average wolf that had been exaggerated by local report. Another hunter from the village was the first to find and kill it. But this reveals so much about both his bravery as well as his noble spirit. When Lafayette was 11, his mother brought the young boy to Paris to live with her and his powerful and titled grandfather. It was a dramatic change. He traded in the small chateau for his grandfather's lavish estate, and was then enrolled in a really prestigious school. No more comfortable clothing or running about the countryside. Instead, he wore a stiff uniform and began a rigorous education. Tragically, both his mother and grandfather died within weeks of each other, not long after this, leaving him at 12 years old an orphan and one of the richest aristocrats in France. He joined the Black Musketeers, a group that served the king in a decorative capacity, not in real combat. He trained at royal riding schools with other young aristocratic boys, 2 of which would have turns on the French throne. Marriage among the French elite was always for the purpose of expanding connections, and Lafayette's was no exception. He was married at a very young age to the second oldest daughter of an equally powerful family. Though it was an arranged marriage, theirs would be one of the grandest love stories of all time, one that I'll expound on from the perspective of Adrienne Lafayette in the next episode. As Lafayette moved about the elite circles of the French aristocracy, attending balls and feasts, he never truly felt comfortable in that way of life. He always wanted something more, something meaningful. A French diplomat and historian wrote, "Lafayette always seemed distant, with a cold, solemn look, as if he were timid or embarrassed. He was very tall and broad-shouldered, but seemed awkward, danced badly, and spoke little. But that distant stare, which contrasted so sharply with the light-hearted arrogance and showy loquaciousness of the people of his age, concealed a fiery spirit, a strong character, and a warm soul." And Lafayette wrote, "What can I say about my entrance into the world of manners? The favor I enjoyed among the young nobility was short-lived, because of the unfavorable impression created by my silence. I listened and observed, but my awkward country manners, and a certain self-respect, made it impossible for me to adapt entirely to the required graces of the court." Lafayette sought greater purpose, brotherhood, and enlightenment outside of the circles of high society. He actually became a Freemason, joining the French Masonic Military Lodge. And as Unger put it, "Nowhere in the political and intellectual darkness of Europe's autocratic monarchies did the age of enlightenment shine brighter than in France's Masonic lodges, where the American Revolution represented a struggle by Freemasons like Washington and Franklin for Masonic principles and a man's right to life, liberty, and property." And it was through his friendship with the Master Mason that Lafayette was invited to join a dinner party with the Duke of Gloucester, the younger brother of King George III. The Duke was openly against his brother's policies in America, and he described the colonists' fight for liberty. Lafayette wrote, "Such a glorious cause had never before rallied the attention of mankind. oppressors and oppressed would receive a powerful lesson. The great work would be accomplished, or the rights of humanity would fall beneath its ruin. The destiny of France, and that of her rival, England, would be decided at the same moment. I gave my heart to the Americans, and thought of nothing else but raising my banner and adding my colors to theirs. He started studying everything that he could find out about America and their cause, determined to somehow become a part of it. Gilbert cast another nervous glance behind the ship, probably the 100th time he'd done so in the past hour. Silas Deane, the American diplomat, seemed to notice his agitation, watching him with a mix of concern and suspicion. So many thoughts battled for dominance in Gilbert's head. He knew he'd be causing quite a stir, to say the least, by his sudden departure. His father-in-law would be furious when he received the letter informing him that his son-in-law had left for America. More importantly, Gilbert hoped his wife Adrienne would be able to forgive him for leaving her and their young daughter behind. And of course the king, who had given him direct orders not to sail to America, would be absolutely livid at his disregard for his command. It was because of his title and prominence that the king had forbade him from enlisting in the cause, fearing that it might spark conflict with Britain, who had already threatened, and followed through on that threat, to send fleets to block France off from America. It seemed everything had been combined against him in his efforts to go and join the American cause. But he had thought of a simple solution to his problem. He would just purchase his own ship and sail out of Bordeaux. He had been returning from a trip to England, visiting his uncle, who was currently acting in the capacity of France's ambassador to England. When Gilbert had arrived in London, his uncle had paraded the arrival of his illustrious nephew, and Gilbert had been the center of attention at every event he attended. Knowing very little English himself, he had simply smiled through the fanfare and introductions. His meeting of King George III and General Sir Henry Clinton had been especially interesting. They, of course, had no idea that the 18-year-old young man standing in front of them would soon be departing to offer his services to their enemies in America. He smiled a little at the irony, but while he hadn't revealed his intentions, he had been open about his feelings, openly praising the Americans and their efforts. He'd invented an excuse to leave England earlier than expected, but instead of going back to Paris, he had prepared to embark to America. But he'd nearly abandoned the entire scheme altogether with thoughts of what he was leaving behind, going so far as to get off the ship and begin riding up country. But he'd inevitably come back, convinced that this was the right course. He'd had to disguise himself as a courier to make it back, but here he stood now, hoping that they would be able to set sail without being arrested by any of the king's men, who no doubt would be in hot pursuit. He still felt incredibly anxious, but he'd made his decision. He would depart for America. While on the ship that Lafayette had bought with his own money, he wrote to his wife Adrienne. This first letter gives a lot of insight into what was going through his head as he was about to depart. He wrote, "It is from far away that I write to you, sweetheart, and to this cruel separation is added the still more dreadful uncertainty of the time when I shall hear from you again. Have you forgiven me? Your grief, that of my friends, Henriette, their child. It all came into my mind with rightful vividness, and for an instant I felt that I had nothing to say in defense of what I was about to do. If you knew what I have suffered, what weary days I have passed fleeing everything I love best in the world, must I yet learn, besides all this, that you refuse to forgive me? Indeed, my sweetheart, in that event I should be too unhappy." A week later he picked the letter back up and continued to write. "I am still out upon this dreary plain, which is beyond comparison the most dismal place that one can be in. I try to console myself a little by thinking of you and our friends at home, and I picture to myself the joy, when I come home, when I rush in unexpectedly to take you into my arms, while defending the liberty I adore, of my own free will, as a friend, offering my services to this most interesting republic, I bring with me nothing but my heart and goodwill. with no personal ambitions to fulfill, no selfish interests to serve, working only for my own glory and for the happiness of the American Republic. I hope that for my sake you will become a good American, for that feeling is worthy of every noble heart." Then he makes this profound insight, the summary of his motives. "The happiness of America is intimately connected with the happiness of all mankind. She is destined to become the safe and venerable asylum of virtue, of honesty, of tolerance, and of peaceful liberty." It leads you to wonder how Lafayette could have known that. The statement almost seems prophetic. And then tenderly he finishes his letter with these words: "Night obliges me to stop, for I have lately forbidden the use of lights about the ship. But with my fingers, directed a little by the impulses of my heart, I have no need of lights to tell you that I love you and shall love you all of my life." Keep in mind that Lafayette is not even 19 years old. How many 19-year-olds do you know that would abandon a life of luxury? Unger described his sacrifice like this: "He was arguably the wealthiest aristocrat in France, with close ties to the king, the royal family, and the entire court. His wife's family was equally wealthy and well-placed. He and his family danced at Marie Antoinette's balls, hunted with the king, and glutted themselves at palace banquets in Versailles. Lafayette turned his back on it all, indeed fled from incomparable luxury, to wade through South Carolina swamps, freeze at Valley Forge, and ride through the stifling southern heat of Virginia as an unpaid volunteer, fighting and bleeding for liberty and a land not his own, for a people not his own." Recounting his landing, Lafayette said, "When I felt American soil under my feet for the first time, my first words were an oath to conquer or die for the American cause." Lafayette's initial welcome in America wasn't the greatest. He probably would have been turned away completely if it weren't for his connections. He spoke very little English and had no actual combat experience, but he offered his influence and, above all, his undying devotion to liberty. Lafayette was instantly taken by the American way of life. He wrote to Adrienne describing what he saw: "A simplicity of manners, a desire to please, the love of country and of liberty are to be found everywhere. The richest man and the poorest are upon the same social level, and although there are some great fortunes in this country, I defy one to discover the least difference in the bearing of one man to another." A defining moment in Lafayette's life came when he caught his first glimpse of George Washington. Unger wrote of that moment, "For Lafayette, the 6'4" tall Washington was the embodiment of the ethereal warrior father who had haunted his imagination since infancy. Statuesque, with the powerful build of a great cavalier, magnificently uniformed, more royal than any European monarch in his fine powdered wig." Lafayette wrote, "Although he was surrounded by officers and private citizens, it was impossible not to recognize the majesty of his face and countenance, the affable and noble manners, and the dignity with which he addressed those about him were equally distinguished." Washington went out of his way to welcome the French young man, praising the zeal that had carried him across the ocean, and inviting him to stay at his home. Thus, one of the most tender, vicarious father-son relationships in history was born. And like Washington, Lafayette refused any payment for his service. And when he saw the bedraggled and ill-equipped Continental Army, Washington turned to him, basically saying that this must be a far cry from the French military that you're accustomed to. But Lafayette replied with great humility that he had come to learn, not to teach, an attitude that set him apart from the other French officers. Despite his inexperience and youth, Lafayette was appointed the position of Major General. He was eager to see action, and finally had his chance at the Battle of Brandywine, where he arrived just in time to rally the American soldiers. He even quit his horse to fight beside them. Washington gained greater respect for his young friend and saw that he had a great talent and judgment for military strategy. Lafayette left the battle a hero, and he also sustained an injury in his leg. As he was being loaded onto a boat to be transported upstream, he heard George Washington tell the physician, "Treat him as if he were my son." As Lafayette was gaining the respect and trust of the Continental Army, rumors of him were spreading all around France. The citizens were mesmerized by tales of the young French knight fighting on American soil. And even the French leaders eventually decided to forego their anger at his departure, realizing that his connections in America might prove to be incredibly valuable for creating ties between the two nations. Lafayette wrote frequently to his wife, expressing his love and telling her of his experiences in America. He told her to adopt the role of a wife of an American general officer. When America was victorious at the Battle of Saratoga, stories flooded Europe about this new nation. Lafayette's letters brought the stories to life. The very people who were most against him became the foremost to applaud his accomplishments. Lafayette quipped, "By quitting France in such a scandalous fashion, I actually served the American Revolution." But that momentum seemed to come to a screeching halt in the winter of 1777, when the British seized Philadelphia and the American troops languished in Valley Forge. Lafayette suffered with them. He could have easily purchased a warm home nearby, but he chose instead to adopt, quote, "American clothes, habits, and food, to appear more simple, frugal, and austere than the Americans themselves, and embrace privation and fatigue." By the end of winter, every soldier referred to Lafayette as "our Marquis," a title that he would retain the rest of his life. But during Valley Forge, there was a lot of opposition against George Washington. However, Lafayette never faltered in his loyalty. When in the company of some of those men who were scheming to remove the general, Lafayette raised his glass, proposing a toast to the health of "our General George Washington." He became one of Washington's most trusted aides, and was the fourth-ranking general at Valley Forge. Meanwhile, Lafayette was constantly sending letters to France, doing his best to persuade them to assist America in the war. And finally, his persistence paid off. Gilbert saw the writer approaching. He and many of the other officers, including Washington, went to greet the messenger, that turned out to be Simeon Dean, brother to Silas Dean, the American diplomat to France, and one of the first Americans Gilbert had ever met. Simeon descended from his horse, procuring a letter which he promptly handed to Washington. It was from Silas Dean himself and Benjamin Franklin in France. Gilbert nearly held his breath. He knew that the two men had been in Paris trying to create an alliance with France and garner their support. Gilbert himself had been tirelessly working and persuading his connections in France to that very end. Washington quickly ripped open the envelope, unfolding the letter. Soldiers gathered all around as Washington began to read. "We have now the great satisfaction of acquainting you and the Congress," Washington began, "that the treaties with France are at length completed and signed." Sounds of elation rippled over the group, but again fell silent as Washington continued. "The first is a treaty of amity and commerce. The other is a treaty of alliance, in which it is stipulated that in case England declares war against France, we should then make common cause of it and join our forces and councils, etc. The great aim of this treaty is declared to be to establish the liberty, sovereignty, and independency, absolute and unlimited, of the United States, as well in matters of government as commerce, and this is guaranteed to us by France. The preparations for war are carried on with immense activity, and it is soon expected." Gilbert felt tears stream down his cheeks as the men around him rejoiced. Overcome with emotion, he reached forward to embrace Washington as the tears flowed. As the celebrations began around the camp, Simeon handed Gilbert another letter, one from his dear wife in Paris. He eagerly opened it, but his heart nearly broke when he read its content. His daughter Henriette had died. It was as though a knife had been plunged into his heart. For a moment, he just stared at the words, nearly choking on the grief that swelled in his chest. His little Henriette, gone. He'd never even been able to say goodbye. And now Adrienne was alone, carrying this heavy burden. how he wished he could be there with her, that they might be able to grieve together. His tears of rejoicing instantly became tears of sorrow, but he wouldn't allow himself to grieve in front of the men. He put on a false smile, determined not to disrupt the happiness of the troops with his own suffering. Gilbert knew how important his role was in obtaining France's help for the cause, but it certainly had not come without a painful price. After receiving news of France's support and his daughter's death, Lafayette wrote to Adrienne late that night saying, "How horrible is our separation. I never before felt the cruelty of separation so deeply. My heart suffers doubly from my own sorrow and from my inability to share yours. The time it took before I learned of it has also increased my misery. The loss of our poor child is almost always on my mind. The news came right after the news of the treaty, and with my heart torn by pain, I had to participate in the public joy." As difficult as that was for Lafayette, it truly was a miraculous day for America. 5 days later, Washington sent out a general order saying, "It having pleased the almighty ruler of the universe to defend the cause of the United States, and finally to raise us up a powerful friend among the princes of the earth, to establish our liberty and independency upon a lasting foundation, it becomes us to set apart a day for gratefully acknowledging the divine goodness and celebrating the important event which we owe to his divine interposition." Washington recognized that Lafayette's coming was nothing short of a miracle, and that he had been raised up by God for that purpose. Lafayette spent 6 more months in America, fighting in several more battles, but as was tradition, fighting would cease for the winter and then pick back up again in the spring. So Washington urged Lafayette to take a leave to go back to his family in Paris. His parting with Washington was a painful one. Washington once said of Lafayette, "I do not know a nobler, finer soul, and I love him as my own son." Lafayette returned to France with great honor, nearly 22 months after he'd left for America, and he had a sweet and beautiful reunion with his family. While in Paris, he and Adrienne had another child, a boy, and they named him George Washington Lafayette, and as you might guess, selected the American general as the boy's godfather. This was a wonderful time for Lafayette and his family, but it only lasted a year. He'd been hard at work negotiating with France, making a proposal, the proposal, that would determine the final outcome of the American Revolution. He urged the French government to, quote, "restore vigor to the American army and end the revolution decisively by sending a naval and military fleet to aid in the conflict." Lafayette wanted to lead the army himself, but was considered too young and inexperienced. Instead, they selected a seasoned major general in his 50s named Rochambeau. But Lafayette was allowed to resume his former position as a major general. He was sent ahead of the rest of the French army to inform Washington in person of the French's intent to support the revolution with 6 ships and 6,000 infantry in the early spring. Lafayette's second departure to the New World could not have been more different than the first. He went in to the French king, taking formal leave, and he shared a heart-wrenching goodbye with his family, having the full support of both. It was a far cry from his fugitive exit 3 years previous. Lafayette also used 120,000 livres, about $1.2 million in today's equivalent of his own money, to equip an entire American division. The steward in charge of his banking warned him that he was buying glory at the expense of his fortune. But Lafayette answered that glory was beyond price, and his wife agreed. Things had been very challenging in America. The winter of 1780 had been crushing. The miserable weather, combined with the lack of provisions, wore away at the army, and Congress in its bankrupt state was in no position to relieve them. The states held most of the power and were quite divided themselves. Desertion had reduced Washington's army in New Jersey to only 6,000 troops. All in all, the prospects for victory were looking very bleak. Unger wrote, "Lafayette's arrival therefore brought the first ray of hope to the gloom that had enveloped America for months. No one knew his mission, but to every American, soldier, and civilian alike, as well as to the Washingtons, he was a knight in shining armor from the chivalric past, come to save the nation. He glowed with enthusiasm, courage, and love of country. His was a unifying presence whose aura enveloped and bound them in a common cause. When Lafayette's ship touched American land, cannons fired, church bells rang, people gathered to see the French warriors return. And when Lafayette greeted the usual austere General Washington, the man's eyes filled with tears. This was truly a joyful reunion. He and Washington then went to a private room, where Lafayette was able to deliver the news of France's support. Even with this support, Washington knew that they would still need help and supplies from Congress to win. So he sent Lafayette personally to deliver a message to Congress, knowing how much everyone admired and respected him. Lafayette seemed to have that effect on everyone that he met. Washington had him personally write letters to the leaders of the different states to try and rally the support and unify the cause. The effect was almost immediate. All responded that they would help provide the supplies and men needed to double the Continental Army. I find it amazing that Lafayette had such a huge impact, especially being as young as he was. But how could you not love and admire someone who was sacrificing so much and expecting nothing in return? But their plans to decisively end the war were threatened when the new French commander Rochambeau arrived with less ships and men than the French monarchs had promised. This pushed victory back and required some more negotiating. It was actually on their way back from a council with Rochambeau, where Lafayette had acted as an interpreter, that Washington, Lafayette, and Alexander Hamilton stopped in for the promised inspection of West Point, and to have breakfast with Benedict Arnold and his wife Peggy. Thus how Lafayette ended up being at Washington's side when the betrayal was revealed. I didn't realize how comforting and appropriate it truly was for Lafayette and Hamilton, both men that Washington considered his adoptive sons, to be there to comfort him through that experience. And it was to Lafayette that he turned and asked, "Whom can we trust now?" Implying, of course, that Lafayette would be above any suspicion of disloyalty, an assessment that he lived to be worthy of. There was no better or undeviating friend of George Washington's than the Marquis de Lafayette. And when Arnold took his place in the British Army, he commanded forces in Virginia, where he fought against an army led by none other than Lafayette himself. In fact, Washington had charged Lafayette to do his best to capture and execute Arnold if he could. There was a point when Arnold wrote to Lafayette asking to exchange prisoners, and Lafayette sent his message back unanswered, insisting that, quote, "A correspondence with Arnold is so very repugnant to my feelings that I can never conquer them so far as to answer his letters. I cannot submit to such a rascal." Arnold was so infuriated by the snub that he threatened to ship all of his American prisoners to the West Indies. Lafayette ended up sending some lower-ranking officers to arrange the exchange, and Arnold is said to have asked one of them, "What do you think the Americans would do with me if they should succeed in making me a prisoner?" One of the American officers answered with what I consider to be one of the greatest rebuffs of all time. He said, "We should cut off the leg which was wounded in the country's service, and we should hang the rest of you." Lafayette pursuing Arnold was an image that people laughed at. The idea of an aristocrat turned American patriot pursuing an American patriot turned aristocrat was a pretty humorous image. Unfortunately, Cornwallis merged his army with Arnold's, booting him from his position, which thwarted Lafayette's plans to capture him. Meanwhile, the British commander Cornwallis became nearly obsessed with capturing the boy, as they called Lafayette. He had become a symbol of liberty and a symbol of France's support of America, and the British wanted nothing more than to send him back to Britain in chains to crush French enthusiasm for the American Revolution. But the opposite took place. Lafayette was able to secure the support of the French, and with their help, secure victory. Satisfaction and gratitude swept over Gilbert as he observed the march of the surrendering British troops. Memories of the siege of Yorktown ran through his mind. When Washington had sent him to the South and ordered that he remain there, it had defied all reason. His men certainly hadn't been happy, especially considering their lowering supplies. But out of loyalty to him, they'd stayed. Everyone had expected the Americans to make an attack on New York to reclaim the city, exactly what Washington had wanted them to think, while he instead planned an attack from the south, where Cornwallis's defenses were much weaker. Lafayette almost laughed as he thought about his confusion, and Washington's cryptic encouragement interjected with his assertions that he planned to attack New York. It all made sense in retrospect, as Washington had expected the letter to be intercepted by the British. Lafayette understood that all too well. It was he, after all, that had funded the creation of an American spy ring behind enemy lines, something that had come in great use in the recent campaign. The 3-week siege in the South had driven Cornwallis's forces to the Chesapeake Bay, where 24 French ships had awaited them. The timing had been perfect, and left Cornwallis with no choice but to surrender. Now they were just awaiting for the official ceremony to be completed. But it was not Cornwallis who approached Washington with Gilbert standing at his side, but his adjutant, General Charles O'Hara. It seemed Cornwallis was feeling ill and could not attend, but Gilbert suspected his sudden illness was the result of an overhelping of humble pie. The uncomfortable adjutant carried Cornwallis's sword in his hand. At first, he attempted to present it to the French commander Rochambeau, but to Lafayette's delight, the French general refused, insisting that Washington was the sole commander-in-chief. Washington, in turn, directed General Lincoln to accept the sword in his behalf, who stepped forward to graciously do just that. The American and French troops formed into 2 lines facing each other, as the sullen-looking British troops marched between them in an act of surrender. The redcoats kept their faces turned toward the French, one last insult against the lowly American rebels that they still considered unworthy foes. Gilbert watched this unfold, then signaled his drum major to play Yankee Doodle. The sound made the eyes of the British troops turn to their American conquerors. Truly, the most unlikely of victors had taken their place on the world's stage. Sometimes we forget that the French's participation in the American Revolution was critical to American victory, and it was only made possible by a noble hero, raised up to be a mediator between the 2 nations. There's so much more that I could tell you about Lafayette. I've barely skimmed the surface of what he actually did in America, and he would go on to spend the rest of his life being a proponent of liberty. He was a tireless advocate for the abolition of slavery. In fact, he and Adrienne bought plantations for the purpose of freeing the slaves, and then turned and gave those men land to make their own living. He stood up for the rights of Protestants who were being persecuted and sought for equality for men and women. I am hard-pressed to think of anyone outside of Jesus Christ himself who so embodied the principles of liberty as the Marquis de Lafayette. He wrote, "How have I loved liberty? With the enthusiasm of religion, with the rapture of love, with the conviction of geometry. That is how I have always loved liberty." We'll talk about his attempt to implement liberty in France in the next episode, and the trials that befell him and his family during the French Revolution. But toward the end of his life, he was invited by Thomas Jefferson, the president at the time, to make one last visit to America. This was a glorious experience for the old Major General. He went to every state where he was treated as the returned hero that he was. One person remarked how well Lafayette commanded English, and he replied, "And why would I not speak English? I am an American after all, just back from a long visit to Europe." Lafayette arrived at Bunker Hill, where he'd fought as a young man, just in time for the 50th anniversary since the battle. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he heard the choir sing the song, Old 100. The lyrics to that song say, "Oh, is not this a holy spot? 'Tis the high place of freedom's birth. God of our fathers, is it not the holiest spot of all the earth?" Then Daniel Webster addressed the crowd, speaking of the veterans of Bunker Hill, and then he addressed Lafayette specifically, saying, "You are connected with both hemispheres and with two generations. Heaven saw fit to ordain that the electric spark of liberty should be conducted through you from the New World to the Old. And we, who are now here to perform this duty of patriotism, have all of us long ago received it in charge from our fathers to cherish your name and your virtues." Lafayette died in Paris, France at age 76, and his son fulfilled his request that a container of dirt from Bunker Hill be poured into his grave, that he might be buried both in French and American soil, the two lands that he loved and gave so much for. All of America unanimously grieved. They seemed to know that he was the last of the chivalric knights of the past, and the world might never see his like of character and selflessness again. For generations, Lafayette was a name everyone knew. His story was told to inspire and to teach the rising generations to appreciate their freedoms. But today, we have not kept that charge to cherish Lafayette's name and virtues. Lafayette as a child was told stories of his ancestors that helped him to rise above the frill and emptiness of the society in which he lived. He was raised hearing about real heroes, and now we're raised hearing about imaginary heroes. And I fear the result is that we've come to shun sacrifice, content to spend our lives seeking pleasure and comfort. Joseph Campbell said, "A hero is someone who has given his or her life to something bigger than oneself." Our generation needs heroes to look to, champions of liberty, champions of Christ, so that we too can rise above the frill and emptiness that surrounds us. And you never know, you might just very well become someone who inspires a nation, rallying them to freedom and igniting their faith.